market tough for Sayonara.
I don't know if you heard my little trail at 10:45, 9:45. I just did it. I just got the time wrong already. Honestly, it's like night following day. Talk about tempting fate. 9:45. It was 9:45 this morning. You hear the little trail that I do, and I say, in hopefully quite tempting terms, the idea is to encourage you to make sure you carry on listening after Nick's headed home. And I say, even Malcolm Tucker would struggle to find the words to describe the latest disasters befalling Downing Street. And I finish recording it, and I say to my producer today, Alex Barnett, I say, everyone knows who Malcolm Tucker is, don't they? That one's all right. And I'll tell you, he looks back at me as blank as a face you will ever see in your life. Never watched the thick of it, no idea who Malcolm Tucker is, and sending my little trail, presuming that his name is a byword for newly invented swear words to describe political disasters sailing off over the horizon. So if you don't know who Malcolm Tucker is, thank you, Niall, who's just texted Crackerjack with an exclamation mark. You've got to be a regular listener. If you don't know who Malcolm Tucker is, he is the character created by Armando Iannucci, modelled on, we are told, Alistair Campbell, and the political advisor, the spin doctor, who could, create profane, foul words from the most basest of metals, usually to describe disasters. So I can't repeat any of them on the radio for the most obvious of reasons. Do you know, I can't even repeat on the radio what the current Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport called me on Twitter because of decency requirements put in place by the broadcast regulator Ofcom. It's just one of those little moments of madness, isn't it? You reflect on just how the word corrupt popped up an awful lot on Nick's show this morning. Just how corrupt things are. That this politician who is supposed to be in charge of dealing with online harms, I can't tell you what she called me on Twitter because it would actually breach broadcasting regulations. It would involve words I'm not allowed to say at 5 minutes after 10 on a Friday morning on the Great British Radio Show. Nadine Dorries, of course, is the politician of whom I speak. And talking of our sort of favourites on this programme, Nadine Dorries would be up there. This disaster that has befallen Boris Johnson, reading Andrew Pearce in the Daily Mail this morning, and it really is. I mean, you'll know I don't often recommend the Daily Mail, albeit that it's a very, very, very different newspaper from what it was under the last editor. The last editor, of course, is the man that Boris Johnson wants to run Ofcom. You see? It's mad, isn't it? It's almost as if everything's linked. So I just drop a little Ofcom comment, bring in a bit of Nadine Dorries, then I mention the Daily Mail and have to mention that the bloke who edited the Daily Mail when it was encouraging the British public to hate judges, you remember, enemies of the people, and crushed the saboteurs, all of these incredibly provocative and some might say insightful front pages. That's the man that Boris Johnson wants to shoehorn into Ofcom, despite the fact that the independent panel of interviewers said this man would be totally unsuitable for the job of running Ofcom. So they decided, and now see if you can spot a pattern, they decided to tear up the whole system and start all over again, because they didn't get the result that they wanted. Which brings us round to Owen Paterson, because, of course, what happened on Wednesday was that the government sought to tear up the whole system, ignore an independent finding by an independent panel, and start all over again with a new system crewed entirely by their own cronies, which would, we presume, deliver precisely the verdicts that they wanted. I don't know what's going to come out of my gob until I start talking at 10 o'clock in the morning. I don't imagine this comes as a major shock to everybody, but there are days when I feel like the kid in The Sixth Sense. I'm sort of seeing patterns. A bit like, you know, what was the film? Was it the mathematician? Not the Alan Turing one, the other one. Where you see the brain, the algorithm in his brain going, and suddenly all these things actually fit in together. So what they're trying to do there is exactly what they tried to do with Owen Paterson. And speaking of history repeating itself, you'll be delighted to hear that at some point in today's proceedings, I'll be running you through the U-turns I can remember. This government, which has, you know, not been in place that long. I'll be running you through the U-turns that I can remember them undertaking already. So, I mention the Daily Mail a lot on this programme, and perhaps a little unfairly sometimes, because, as we've just observed, it is, the Telegraph now is plumbing the depths that used to be plumbed, and it pains me to say this, because, of course, it was my late father's old newspaper, but it pains me to point out that this now plumbs the depths of, almost delusional, actually, drop the almost, absolutely delusional propaganda on behalf of the government. As Dennis the Menace is to the Beano, so Boris Johnson is to the Daily Telegraph. So they now really are at the very, very bottom of it. They're kind of what you find after you've scraped the bottom of the barrel, whatever's below the bottom of the barrel. But I talk about the Daily Mail a lot because it wields so much power over Middle England, and it's not just a professional obsession, it's a personal one as well. You can watch people change according to how much of the old Daily Mail they used to inject into their veins. These are the people still who will be persuaded, for example, that GPs are their new enemy. GPs, doctors, yeah, bad guys, bad guys. These are the people that thought, of course, that leaving the European Union would make their lives better. A couple of stories for you later in the programme today about yet more evidence mounting that it's making our lives worse. Do you know that we're now having to export carcasses to the continent to be butchered and then imported back in again to be sold? It means that we now have to send dead pigs to Portugal in order for them to be turned into gammon that can now be brought back to Britain. I mean, the mind boggles. A little bit more on that later in the programme. Also, shortages of taxi drivers. There's a phrase I never thought I'd say on this radio programme, but that's now becoming pretty acute, and I suspect anybody who's tried to get a taxi in normal circumstances recently will know that something very odd is going on in that sector, one that we keep a very close eye on this programme historically. But the Daily Mail today, for the second day running, goes for Boris Johnson with a vigour and a venom that they normally reserve for people trying to cross the English Channel, desperate people trying to cross the English Channel in dinghies. They are going for Boris Johnson with all, and it includes their columnist, the supremely absurd Richard Littlejohn. Even he has fallen into line behind the editorial. I mean, all of the people who've been telling you for years that Boris Johnson is the absolute bee's knees are now, it would seem, on this newspaper at least, are now changing tack. There are questions you and I can't answer because we are not in the room where it happens. Okay? Why? What's going on? Is Michael Gove somehow positioning himself for a leadership bid? Is the Daily Mail getting its tanks on Boris Johnson's lawn because of a bigger master plan? Or is it just a 48-hour hiatus from the normal hagiography that they treat the current Prime Minister to? Or is it actually a sign of things to come? Is it actually a sea change? We don't know this stuff. It was John Nash was the mathematician I was searching for a moment ago. Many thanks indeed. And I don't know, nor do you. Well, maybe you do, actually. I think the editor listens. So do feel free, give us a call, tell us exactly what's going on this. 0345 606 0973. But this is big, okay? Is anybody in charge at number 10? That's a rhetorical question. Since Dominic Cummings left, love him or loathe him. And frankly, if you love him, then you probably need medical help. But still, love him or loathe him. Dominic Cummings was in charge at number 10. Now, nobody is. See pages, this is the front of the Mail today. See pages 8 to 13. See pages 8 to 13. That's the kind of coverage they normally reserve for desperate people crossing the English Channel in dinghies. So this is, I mean, to me, and probably to you, because I've been treating you to these insights and analyses now for a very, very long time, this is really big. And I want you to tell me why. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I want you to tell me why. Why is this the one that appears to be coming closest to breaking the camel's back? Why this straw? For you, or you can do what I do every morning and step back from the fray and try and work out what everybody else is up to. I was just having a chat with a colleague who's been here almost as long as I have, a moment ago. I voted for Boris Johnson to be Mayor of London back in the mists of time. Would it be 2008? And by 2009, I was presenting radio programmes that asked, what's it going to take for the scales to fall from your eyes? Because they fell from mine pretty quickly. I can't remember precisely what it was. It may have involved a firefighters dispute. And one of the most surreal encounters I've ever had in a radio studio with the bloke that headed up the great GLA's Fire and Emergency Planning Authority. God, you'd have to be old school to remember that, wouldn't you? You really would. But I can't remember what it was precisely that made me look at my rearview mirror, see how I'd voted in the London mayoral election in 2008 and barely recognise the eyes that were looking back at me. What the flip were you thinking of, you absolute lemon? I'm talking to myself now. What on earth possessed you to vote for someone who is so categorically and clearly incompetent? Obviously, the fact that millions and millions and millions of other people have done the same, both then and since, is something of a comfort to me. But the question of what it would take for the scales to fall from your eyes is a question that I must have been asking now for 12 years. I must have been asking it since 2009 or thereabouts. And I'm not going to ask it today. Not yet, anyway. Partly because I've asked it so many times before and all the answers are largely going to be the same. But this story is different. Owen Paterson's despicable conduct, and I use that word advisedly, because the desperate attempts to wriggle off the hook have made a bad situation infinitely worse. And that might be part of the answer to the question, why this story? It's not the egregiousness of the offence, is it? Because if he'd taken his medicine, if he'd expressed remorse, if he'd gone with the findings of the committee, in fact, I'm told that if he'd accepted he'd done wrong, the suspension would probably have only been 7 days. You're barely going to notice 7 days. But it was his insistence that he'd done nothing wrong, and his defence never got any further than, but I'm Owen Paterson. That was his defence. Yes, I did all of these things, but they're not bad things because I'm Owen Paterson. And the idea that somehow proves emblematic of a bigger picture, it seems to speak to many of us of precisely that sense of entitlement, that weird combination of arrogance and ignorance that sums up, obviously, Brexit, but increasingly sums up Boris Johnson's entire regime. That seems to be not the... Well, I could be wrong. You might be absolutely outraged by the fact that he took £500,000 off companies and lobbied on their behalf, despite the fact that you're not allowed to take money off companies and lobby on their behalf. It's that simple. Normally, if, of course, the Daily Mail was trying to defend its political allies, I would now be telling you the reality of the situation and trying to undo some of the damage done by the rhetoric and rubbish being put out by newspapers to defend their favourite politicians. Luckily, I don't have to do that today. There's no debate here. He took £500,000 off 2 companies, lobbied government, lobbied ministers on their behalf, despite the fact that it is not allowed to lobby ministers on behalf of companies that you've taken money from. 500,000 spondulics. So it might be that. You might not care about what happened next, the wriggling and the obfuscation and the parliamentary disaster. What happened, by the way, is a direct consequence of what happens when you put Jacob Rees-Mogg in charge of anything. Andrew Pearce's piece in the Mail today leaves no stone unturned, and all of this is basically down to Jacob Rees-Mogg being a man who would struggle to tie his own shoelaces without the help of his nanny. And, of course, his nanny can't get involved in parliamentary affairs, which, is probably a shame in the great scheme of things, given that he remains leader of the House. So it might just be the original offence, or it might be one of the ripples. So let's see Owen Paterson's egregious conduct as a fairly large rock that has been lobbed in to the political pool. Why is this story so different from all the stories that have gone before? Is it because of the rock? Is it because of the bloke what threw it? Or is it because of some of the ripples caused by the initial egregious offence? Your thoughts on this? 0345 60 60973. And don't get too excited if you are as dismayed and as worried as I am by the current direction of traffic towards what some people are now beginning to call an urbanisation of British politics, a sort of state capture, if you like, of institutions that we've seen unfold in Hungary, because the Mail are not turning against the Conservative Party. I could reassure you of that categorically. They're just turning against Johnson, and I want to know why. And why now? Why this story? Why has the worm turned, if you like, the right-wing media and also Conservative MPs a lot more loudly in private than they are being in public, but a sense that something snapped on Wednesday when 250 MPs, and I don't have much sympathy for them, I've got to be honest with you, but largely against their better judgment, voted to essentially rewrite the rules of football after Owen Paterson got spanked 3-0. Anthony's in Croydon. Anthony, what do you reckon?
Oh, good morning, James. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
I think when you look at some of the pictures that was being transmitted with Patterson sitting on the benches and listening to all these guys coming to his defence, and also the fact that it was a 3-line whip as well, which was quite amazing in itself. If you imagine, like, even you at work now, if your bosses turned around and said, right, you definitely have to put £10 into the kitty, I don't care what you say, otherwise you're in trouble, and everybody else is doing it, you then don't want to be the one left out, you know? So I think that's what it was as well.
Right.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Oh, honestly, no.
Okay, right. So the 3-line whip, you will have to vote with this thing, and then a lot of people...
Oh, I know what the 3-line whip is. So you think people were disgusted by what happened? Which,
oh, totally.
Yeah, okay. I kind of think that's probably a given, but the idea that they all went along with it. I mean, the point about the 3-line whip is that they arguably have precious little choice, and some of the detail emerging now is grim. The threat that money for their constituencies as part of the so-called levelling up agenda would somehow mysteriously disappear if they didn't fall into line behind the vote. Lee's in Spelthorne. Lee, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. For me, I think it's because it exposes the culture of just protecting your mates and protecting your buddies. You know, they're actually trying to make a virtue this morning of Boris Johnson standing up for Patterson because he's a good guy and he felt it's the...
Who's trying to do that? Who's trying to do that?
Well, the Tory MPs and Boris Johnson.
Are they still? Because you'll forgive me, I'm not biting your head off. I'm just not quite up to speed with this. So I've heard Nadeem Zahawi doing the rounds, sort of saying he made a mistake, but we've all got to move on. I haven't heard anyone trying to cast Boris Johnson as some sort of thwarted knight in shining armour.
Well, your colleague Nick Ferrari did on his show this morning, and some callers did, and I'm sure...
Oh, OK, no, callers, of course, that's fine, but I thought you meant public figures.
I think the guy on Newsnight did last night as well, Paul Scully.
Yeah, more than likely. But I just wanted to clarify who we were describing here. I mean, that's pretty desperate, isn't it? Wasn't that the woman yesterday who said on the show that it's a bit like someone burgles your house and then one of his mates turns up to say, yeah, but he fed the cat on the way out.
Well, I agree, but I think it's more serious than that.
Well, of course
for me, it draws an analogy to some of the issues we've seen in the policing in the last few weeks, because the culture that's exposed in the police, if you look at the pictures of the two poor girls that were murdered,
yes,
it's exposed the culture of, well, you know, we know they've done wrong there, but we'll protect them because they're good guys, they're our mates. That's exactly what Johnson's doing. It's
a circling of the wagons.
Yes.
So
yeah.
it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you've done. All that matters is who you are, and if you're. Well, I mean, this is why I didn't quite understand why Brexit was brought into it, Lee. And you'll know if you've listened to the programme for more than 7 seconds, I'm someone who can bring Brexit into almost anything. I'm working on bringing it into the football results. But when Charles Moore wrote this article in The Telegraph about how Owen Paterson was the latest Brexiter to be a victim of, I don't know what he was a victim of, the rules, scrutiny, accountability, responsibility, but that fits your model, because this isn't just protecting a politician who happens to be a Conservative, because Johnson's got a long and proud history of throwing pretty much anyone under a bus when push comes to shove, as he ultimately did yesterday. But it was a Brexit circling of the wagons, around a Brexiter. It was this idea, that's why David Davis came out and wrote an article, Charles Moore came out and wrote an article. So that idea that if you are in our inner circle, if you're one of the gang, you're golden.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's what the public are seeing now, and that's why this one's hit home so hard, I think. But to actually make a virtue of, oh well, Boris Johnson only did it because he's a good guy. So let's not punish any of the good guys then that break the law, because they're good guys. We like them.
And by good guy, we just mean I like them, don't we? Because I mean, there's not many moral compasses which would end up pointing to good when you're looking at Boris Johnson in general or Owen Paterson's conduct in this case.
Which is why it exposes them for not believing the rules apply to them. The rules are for the little people.
But yeah. So then I come back at you, and I say, and I know I kind of do this for a living, and you obviously pay more attention than many. But I said, but this has been going on for years. Johnson's teacher at Eton wrote about how he thinks the rules are only for other people and not for him. So why has this example of something that's been evident for 40 years or more, why has this example landed in a way that all the other examples have not?
I just think because it's been so blatant. I mean, Owen Patterson was clearly found guilty on numerous occasions by these committees. And then
found guilty once of numerous offences, just to be pedantic. That's all right.
Of doing the same thing on numerous occasions, and he was so unrepentant, saying he would do it absolutely the same again, and he's done nothing wrong. The arrogance, I think, is the bit that's hit home with people, and the arrogance to say, well, okay, well, he's paying to rights, but we're going to change the rules to let him off.
Yeah, I mean, almost this sort of feudal sense of superiority, that two-pronged fork, if you like. The defence was, I've done all these things, you're absolutely right, I have, but I'm Owen Paterson, so they're not actually offences. Oh, and by the way, I'd do them all again. I did an element in what Lee says, again, going to this really forensic piece by Andrew Pearce today, who'll be with you on LBC, of course, later today, talking about how Johnson was particularly exercised by the arrogance, for want of a better word, that Patterson displayed in the studios. We touched on this yesterday. When he said, I'd do it again tomorrow. I'd do it again tomorrow. That apparently was something that really broke Boris Johnson's support. But the whole case, if he'd followed the whole case, he should have known that was Patterson's position from the start. I mean, he said it out loud on Sky News and Channel 4 News, I'd do it again tomorrow. But his whole rejection of the findings of the committee was based upon the fact that he didn't think he'd done anything wrong and he would do it all again tomorrow. If he'd been repentant, if he'd admitted his wrongdoing, he'd have got a 7-day suspension, and we'd probably still remember him for being the bloke that said only a madman would leave the single market, which for me is actually his political legacy. This is just sleaze. But in terms of damage done to the fabric of the nation, remaining loyal to a Brexit that you described under the terms only a madman would actually leave the single market is, to me, a mark of absolute intellectual and moral degeneracy. 28 minutes after 10 is the time. I'll squeeze in John in Mansfield. John, what do you think?
Hello, yes. I'd just like to comment on one fact.
Good, because you've only got a minute.
Right, and that is the absolute power of the House of Commons. Yesterday, they more or less prostituted themselves and stand over to Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
That's why the Daily Mail is worried. They want to get rid of Boris Johnson because they see him as a threat. The man is totally lost with power, doesn't know where he's coming or going. And the sad thing about it is the House of Commons, which is above the Queen, above everybody, on Wednesday...
It's turned into a poodle.
Well, unfortunately, it's a very simple thing because something like that can happen so easily, and suddenly democracy is gone. And what happened in America, oh my God.
I know. And also, Hungary, Poland, Brazil, all elected. Donald Trump, all elected.
But I think I think my member of Parliament, Mr. Bradley in Mansfield, I am disgusted with. He walked in there and, with a conscience, voted to sell himself down the river and let Parliament go heck. That is terrible. The House of Parliament.
That's Ben Bradley, is it, in Mansfield?
We've got. Pardon?
Ben Bradley, is it, in Mansfield?
Yes, right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, he's got a long and glorious history of contributions to public life, hasn't he, Sean? I mean, you've got to let him off this one.
But unfortunately, I don't want to talk about personalities, James. But the thing about it is the overall picture. If you go down through history, a king lost his head over something similar. Right?
Crikey.
Where Parliament is absolute in this kingdom. Parliament, not the Queen, not the President, not the Prime Minister, Parliament. And when Parliament sells itself, Parliament does a terrible injustice to the people of the country.
That is a really powerful contribution. And I'm such a child. I bridled a bit when you said I don't want to talk about personalities, just a tiny bit, because I thought you were giving me a bit of a slap there. And you no, John, you were quite right to do so. You can lose sight sometimes. I did get it right yesterday morning. I went in on exactly the line you've just described. But you're right. This is a lot more serious than the usual toing and froing.
Very serious, because the thing about it is, James, and I don't want to draw any parallels between now and the 1930s, but at the end of the day, in the 1930s, the Reichstag gave Mr. Hitler total power. They said, you can run the country, we'll sit back.
You can do whatever you want. And those 250 Tory MPs essentially on Wednesday, and these parallels are always, of course, as the Archbishop of Canterbury discovered earlier this week, you need to tread very carefully, but you've expressed yourself very, very carefully, that the idea of handing one leader the powers that should be exercised and scrutinised, crucially, by Parliament, has a very, very ugly precedent and a very ugly history. John, thank you. Crikey. That's the second voter in 2 days regretting the decision that they took in 2019. And I do wonder how much feedback was coming through MPs' inboxes and Downing Street itself about events on Wednesday. That notion of this being a straw that broke a particular camel's back fascinates me. But as John has reminded us, the fascination by the toing and froing and the tittle-tattle is as nothing compared to the scale of the danger that appeared on the horizon during that vote on Wednesday. 10:32 is the time. My apologies for the delay. Thomas Watts is here with the headlines. It gets worse. So in a desperate attempt to insulate himself from criticisms of being woefully out of touch, the producer Alex Barnett just involved Keith now in his attempts to defend not knowing who Malcolm Tucker was. He said to Keith, do you know who Malcolm Tucker was? And Keith said, what, the bloke off Grange Hill? It's a miracle we get this programme out. Thank God for people like Theo Usherwood to bring the political clout to proceedings that is clearly not going to come from anywhere else, myself included. Now, speaking of Theo Usherwood, I'm just going to consult with my crack team of advisors who've never heard of Malcolm Tucker. We haven't summoned the Usherwood, have we, today? No? No one's heard a trumpet blast, even quietly. There's been no... So what on earth are you doing here?
Well, I'm here to tell you a story because you'll remember that last month Boris Johnson and his wife Carrie Johnson travelled to southern Spain to stay at the luxury villa of Lord Goldsmith, known to most people as Zach Goldsmith. The villa has its own helipad, 5 bedrooms, large swimming pool, and rents were told for around £25,000 a week.
A week, 25 grand a week.
A week.
Gosh.
Now, yesterday, the Prime Minister revealed in his ministerial register of interest that he had stayed there free of charge. No mention of any benefit in kind. The short entry reads, the Prime Minister has a long-standing personal friendship with the Goldsmith family, and in that capacity, in October 2021, stayed in a holiday home in southern Spain, which was provided free of charge by the Goldsmiths. Given Lord Goldsmith is a Minister of the Crown, the arrangement has accordingly been declared.
Who put him in the Lords?
Boris Johnson did.
Oh, okay. Right.
But that's important, so we'll come back to that in a moment.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify.
But yes.
I may have forgotten.
However, I discovered no entry had been made in the latest entry of MP's financial register of interest that ran up to October the 18th. Mr Johnson returned from holiday on October the 14th. Now, Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner, has written to the Commissioner for Standards, Catherine Stone, asking her to investigate to see whether any of the rules have been broken by the Prime Minister. And she writes, it's worth noting that Lord Goldsmith was given a peerage and a ministerial job by Mr Johnson. The public could understandably draw the conclusion in this case that the Prime Minister is dishing out cushy jobs for his friends who pay for his luxury holidays. And it's also worth noting that when the Commissioner concluded her last report into one of the Prime Minister's holidays, she wrote the following. The Commissioner concluded that Mr Johnson was required under the House's rules to register the holiday accommodation he received. Now that, of course, was in relation to a holiday to the Caribbean island of Mystique over the Christmas and New Year break following the 2019 election victory. In that case, he received a donation. This is the Prime Minister, a donation in kind in the form of the rental of a luxury villa from the telecoms boss David Ross to the tune of £15,000, James. And there is a formal entry in the MP's register of interest. Now, I've spoken to Number 10 about this, no statement from them on or off the record, but they insist the holiday in Spain has been declared properly, and I've been pointed to the Code of Conduct for MPs, Category 4, Paragraph 35, subsection C, which says visits wholly unconnected with membership of the House or with the members' parliamentary or political activities are exempt from being declared within the MP's financial register of interest. But as Angela Rayner points out in that letter, there is a question mark over that because Lord Goldsmith received a life peerage post the 2019 election. The donation of a week at his holiday villa, and this is Angela Rayner's point, cannot be seen as being wholly unconnected with the membership of the House. The other part of the defence is under Category 2 if the trip has been registered with another relevant government department. And of course, as I was pointing out earlier, Mr Johnson has registered the holiday in the Ministerial Register of Interest, which is of course published by the Cabinet Office. But that entry, as I mentioned at the top, makes no mention of the rental value. And I've been onto the villa's website to check availability, and it is actually fully booked until the end of March next year.
So this then goes to the Commissioner?
So this letter then goes to, which you have a copy of now goes to the Commissioner, Catherine Stone, and in the last...
And there are some reports that one of the motivations for Boris Johnson's catastrophic decision on Wednesday, A, to put Jacob Rees-Mogg in charge of proceedings, and B, to seek to overturn and indeed perhaps hold below the waterline Catherine Stone, the commissioner, was that she found he'd been in breach involving his last holiday.
And what's also interesting, there's reports today.
So he's come back and done the same thing again, in a way. He's not registered this on the grounds that it's got nothing to do. I understand that he's not registered it on the members' interest, on the grounds that it's got nothing to do with politics.
It's nothing to do with his political or parliamentary.
The villa, the estate, the hacienda belongs to a bloke who lost his seat in the last election and then got put in the House of Lords by Boris Johnson.
Yes.
But borrowing his 25 grand a week villa for nothing has got nothing to do with politics. That's the current line from Downing Street.
Yes.
Okay, well, I mean, people can make their own minds up
with
about
politics in the House of Commons, but of course, or in the House of Parliament, I should say,
yes,
not
of
just
course,
in the House of
one's
Commons.
in the Lords, one's in the Commons, but it's got nothing to do with the Lords or the Commons.
That's what I've been told.
I mean, you know, who hasn't borrowed a villa, some might say, who wouldn't borrow their mate's flat? And the response to that would be, we're not Prime Minister. So you don't just have to be transparent and above reproach, you have to be a million miles above reproach and more transparent than the cleanest window in history.
So the Commissioner will now investigate, as a result of Angela Rayner's letter, whether Mr Johnson has broken the rules, having expressly been told in the report into his last holiday by the Commissioner Catherine Stone that he was actually right to register that holiday in the MP's Register of Financial Interests.
Curiouser and curiouser. Theo Rushworth, LBC's political editor. You didn't need a summons, mate. That was well worth you barging into the studio like a prop forward. Many thanks indeed. We will, of course, bring you any developments in that story. So a free holiday at Zach Goldsmith's family villa. Goldsmith, of course, lost his Richmond Park seat in the 2019 election. That was then given a peerage by Mr Johnson so he could remain a junior minister. Who was the politician that brought in legislation that meant that if an MP behaved in a way
Zach Goldsmith in 2015.
Oh. Well, that's a bit odd. So he brought in the legislation of recall, which meant that if an MP behaved in a way that the constituency disapproved of, that, which was something that Owen Paterson was perhaps facing, then they could somehow call him back. Even they didn't have to wait for a general election or a by-election to get rid of him or her. Goldsmith championed legislation that would allow constituents to get rid of an MP without having to wait for an election if it had enough support.
Yeah, 10%.
And then they got rid of him in Richmond Park. And he walked into the House of Lords. It's quite a double standard, isn't it?
And he's a minister, a joint minister in the environment.
So he's a minister in the government, having championed legislation that allowed constituents to get rid of MPs without having to wait for an election. They got rid of him in an election, and he still feels, what's that word I'm looking for? Entitled to sit in government. And it's got nothing to do with politics that he just gave a 25 grand a week freebie.
But just to clarify, James, the complaint by Angela Rayner is against the Prime Minister.
Yes, of course it is. I'm just pointing out the context.
Yeah, I know.
As well, you know, there is nothing wrong. If you had a flat that was worth 25 grand a week, you can give it to whoever you want. I'm allowed to wonder why and what might have been in it for you. And if you had mysteriously got a peerage, despite not necessarily having displayed much talent in your political career previously and having led a mayoral campaign that many consider to be quite racist, you end up in the House of Lords, and the next thing you know, the bloke who gave you the peerage is on a 25 grand a week freebie in your Spanish hacienda.
That's the view of Angela Rayner and people who have been looking at this.
That's not a view, that's just a statement of facts.
Yes, James.
Angela Rayner's view is that there might be something to answer here. There might be questions to answer, but the description of a bloke getting thrown out by his constituents, having run a mayoral campaign that many considered to be racist, having not displayed a great deal of political acumen while in the House of Commons, ends up in the House of Lords, and a couple of years later gives a 25 grand a week freebie to the man who put him there.
That's a summation, yes.
Chair Ashford, earning his beans once again live on LBC. I mean, headlines are important, aren't they? I mean, if you wrote it like this, one of the left-wing websites, and I think it works. I don't think it falls foul of the fact test. MPs who just voted to scrap Parliament's anti-corruption rules and let a corrupt MP off the hook. It's one of those words that I worry about using too much. I often preface the word corruption with moral corruption, because, of course, to accuse someone of corruption which could be construed as criminal would have quite a high legal bar to clear, a libel bar, I presume, to clear. The moral corruption is very much in the eye of the beholder. But we used to live in a country where we could broadly agree on what was morally corrupt and what was not. But if you break rules, you corrupt them, don't you? So to describe Owen Paterson as corrupt as this website has done, I think is technically correct. But to describe 250 Tory MPs as having voted to scrap Parliament's anti-corruption rules is actually just true. The defence would be, of course, that, well, yes, but we're going to replace them with something else. The problem there was that they put Rees-Mogg in charge of replacing them, and he didn't check with anybody about whether anyone else in the House of Commons would go along with it. So you end up with this bill being put before the House of Commons that would essentially allow the Conservative Party to replace the current anti-corruption system with a system populated by a majority of Conservative MPs. And obviously everyone else in the House of Commons said we're not going to go along with that. It didn't cross Jacob's mind, apparently, according to the reports that are now filtering through with a level of detail that suggests Johnson, the chief whip, and Jacob Rees-Mogg are, I mean, they're not going to be taken off any Christmas card lists at the moment in the Conservative Party, but crikey, there is a reviewing of affections, a reviewing of enthusiasms, because what these 250 MPs who sold their soul for a mess of pottage are doing today is looking for someone to blame it on. It's a human condition, of course, that when you're looking for someone to blame your own behaviour on, the last person you look at is yourself. We're all guilty of that. So when this lot look around, who can we blame? Who put us in this unconscionable position? Who made us vote for something gross and then abandoned the vote after we'd sold our souls to deliver it? And I think the answer is going to be the chief whip and J-Dog on this one, which is such a tragedy for Jacob because, you know, I mean, such a paragon of virtue. My particular favourite would be the time that he went to Balmoral to mislead Her Majesty the Queen about the unlawful proroguing of Parliament. And if you want to talk about moral corruption, it's hard to know where to start with this lot, which is why the question I'm asking you today is why this? Why now? If you listen to this programme on a regular basis, you could make a case for saying this one doesn't even get into the top 5 of things that they've done. You know how I feel about lying to the Queen or misleading the Queen about the unlawful proroguing of Parliament. That, to me, was a bigger moment, I think, than this. So why this? Why now? And in some ways, the best contributors will be the people who are now feeling those scales fall from their eyes. And I just remind you again that I'm not here to mock you or laugh at you or have any schadenfreude at all, because I voted for Boris Johnson to be Mayor of London in 2008, so I'm on no high horse here about, I got wise to his jive a little bit earlier, but I certainly fell for it. So no smug sneering from me about people who fell for it a little later and a little longer than I did. 10:52 is the time. Lewis is in Ealing. Lewis, what do you reckon?
I reckon it's... Oh, morning, James, by the way.
Hello.
I reckon it's because it's hurting the wrong people, is my roundabout way of doing it. So how I'll explain it is it's us and them. But in this case, us is the public and them is the politicians exploiting the situation, much like the expenses scandal. And I think that people aren't willing to put up with it in this situation because we would for the national benefit, in our view. So even with proroguing Parliament, that was to get Brexit done. And the people who support it, because it's us versus Europe.
So they'd have forgiven anything in that period of politics.
Yes. In my opinion.
No, do you know what? I feel a bit stupid now. You're absolutely right.
And because
that's why Get Brexit Done was such a lever, wasn't it? It was such a powerful... I mean, you and I perhaps knew that it was both dangerous and meaningless in equal measure, but for the people that it was designed to seduce, it was a very, very powerful... Not just a slogan, it was deeper than a slogan. It was a very powerful psychological tool.
That's why they use the sort of war mentality.
Yes, of course.
People will take the hardship. You know, you'll take rations. You'll do what's in the good for. You'll take that pain because it's for it's for the country. It's for everyone else. It's for our society. Our It's us.
But our gang, our lot, the levers, call them what you will. They can do whatever they want. They can ride roughshod over the courts. Why the Daily Mail front pages got forgiven? Trying to turn the public against MPs, crush the saboteurs, trying to turn the public against judges, enemies of the people. It all got forgiven because of this warlike mission, which the harder you looked at it, the more you realised it was nonsense, but it was very intoxicating while it lasted.
Yeah, and so I think in this case,
you're right.
It's almost purely selfish, because I spoke to you about Matt Hancock, and I was trying to say the whole point about it's because it was a selfish act, and that's why it's cut through.
Yes.
And we kind of disagreed about why and things.
And who's been proved right in retrospect? You, I sense.
Well, in this particular case, on this particular example.
No, take it seriously. Take your lap of honour. It's a pleasure to be wrong on occasion when you're being exposed to such epic rightness. So you got Hancock right. So that's the same principle. So I will forgive you anything if you are delivering this thing I think I want in the face of epic resistance from Ramonas and Jean-Michel Barnier and I don't know, Mark Carney, the governor. And judges, bloody judges.
I think that's why the PPE contracts didn't cut through, because people were willing to accept that corruption because it was a national crisis.
Alleged corruption. I think it's still alleged corruption.
Alleged corruption, in my opinion.
Yeah, sure.
But they were trying to get PPE for the NHS for this crisis. And so people, even I'm willing to say, well, no, but you would go to your mates who could provide PPE.
I am as well. If you sat next to someone at dinner who said, I've got a little factory in Sri Lanka that's been knocking out these face masks for the last 10 years, you'd think, well, let's hire him. We're desperate.
Because it's in the national interest. You'd cut them the slack. It's like, well, maybe they didn't do it the right way, but they were doing it for the right reason. And
in the first instance, that defence, I think that might begin to crumble as more and more detail emerges.
I'm sure it will. But
you're right. You're right. That is a really powerful overview, actually. So, and that's very helpful for me, because I'm as vulnerable to blinkers as the next man. Although my blinkers are anti-Brexit, they're still as unhelpful as pro-Brexit blinkers. And so, of course, you would forgive Boris Johnson anything while he was delivering this thing you thought you wanted. Leaving aside
the people wanted it.
Yeah. But I'm thinking about the people that would wave through all the previous U-turns, all the previous offences, all the previous unlawful proroguings of Parliament, lying, even the Queen, all these, I nearly used a very inappropriate term there about what people like to do to flags, but all of these people who have a lot of flags in their online profiles are supposed to put the Queen above all else, but somehow even Brexit managed to be bigger even than her, so Jacob Rees-Mogg can go and mislead the Queen. Parliament can be unlawfully prorogued, and all the so-called patriots are cheering it because Brexit had become this massive thing. But when they do stuff that's not hitched to the Brexit bandwagon, then the moral compass starts working again.
Yeah, that's my view.
That's brilliant. I'm nicking it. It's not yours anymore, Lewis. It's mine now. Have a great weekend. Can we just remove that from the record, please? So here's what I think has happened. I don't know if anyone else has said this yet, but clearly, once you remove the Johnson juggernaut from the Brexit bandwagon, then he gets judged according to a more objective moral compass than the completely distorting lens that Brexit applied to many of his previous offences. I think we should clip that up. That's a really powerful insight. Carl's in Salford. Carl, what would you like to say?
I do, James. First time.
Well, we're going to sort that phone line out, Carl. Unless you are actually a Dalek, in which case I apologise for my insensitivity. James is in Barnes. James, what would you like to say?
Hi, morning, James. James, there's an old... sorry, that's my post. There's an old saying that Max Hastings said about Boris Johnson when he was the editor of The Telegraph, that Boris Johnson is shafted everybody that he's come into contact with. And I think that maybe for the first time, Boris Johnson has shafted all the MPs in one fell swoop. And I think in all the other things, the proroguing of Parliament, because there were so many of them that had an interest in proroguing Parliament, and there were a lot who, as we know, who he took the whip away, Nicholas Soames, the grandson of Churchill, etc., etc.
Yeah.
But in this occasion, I think that he has, and he always thinks he can run roughshod and do what he wants, and I think he's in one fell swoop, he has shafted his whole party.
Are we having a leopards eating face party moment?
Potentially.
When
yes.
I voted for the Leopards Eat People's Faces party, I didn't realise the leopards were going to eat my face, is what some of these MPs are now thinking.
Yeah, exactly. And what is even more astonishing is that, and I'm not going to lump them all together, that they're all intelligent and bright people, but there's a lot of bright people in that cabinet.
There's a lot of epic thickos. There's a lot of very stupid people as well. I'm not mentioning any names.
Got to be. But you have to question, what on earth are they thinking to actually, because like you said, this man admitted.
Well, it's not a mystery. It's self-interest. They are thinking.
Completely.
I mean, whether they're kidding themselves about it or whether they're consciously holding their noses, they are sacrificing what passes for their integrity upon the altar of self-advancement, power and greed. It's why, very, very briefly, the one that libelled me, what's her name, Angela Richardson, deserves some credit for actually abstaining on this vote while knowing it would mean that she lost her job as a PPS to Michael Gove. She then got her job back, which in retrospect I suppose is fair enough if they've actually abandoned the thing that she voted for. But 13 I think voted. 1 or 2 of those abstentions retrospectively turn out to be vaguely honourable. The ones doing a lap of honour in the studios yesterday, trying to give themselves a round of applause while actually sitting on their hands, are ridiculous. They probably do fall into the category of not very bright. But for the rest of them, it's a brilliant question. And the more senior they are, why did they do something so obviously wrong? Answer, because they were ordered to. And I don't know that I was only following orders is much of a defence. The one thing I missed, and I kicked myself about this because it was right up my strasser, was the events of Wednesday were a prime example of people not liking a result and therefore having a vote in order to get a different result, which some of us spent years being told was the most awful and appalling of behaviour ever contemplated in this country. We don't like the result, therefore we should have a vote until we get the result that we want. The difference being, of course, that in a referendum on a second referendum on European Union membership, it would have been a more informed electorate voting the second time than the first time, whereas the vote in the House of Commons on Wednesday was a 3-line whip to essentially tear up the rule book regarding corruption after one of their own was found to have broken the rules regarding corruption. I mean, it is mad, right? I mean, there's so many days. You remember the flesh-coloured body stocking? Do you remember the flesh-coloured body stocking? We used to talk a lot about the flesh-coloured body stocking because there are days when you do this job in a media environment that routinely cheers the Emperor's New Clothes to the rafters. And when you do this job from the perspective of the lad in the crowd who's pretty sure he's naked, there are days when you begin to doubt yourself. And on those days, I used to, particularly with Theresa May, actually, and her Brexit approach, I used to think, well, maybe there is some sort of plan. Maybe there is something going on here that I just can't discern, or that is too clever for me to grasp. And those were the days when I'd talk about a flesh-coloured body stocking. And I'd say, maybe the Emperor's not actually naked. Maybe the Emperor is wearing a flesh-coloured body stocking and looks very, very naked from here, and indeed from there, and from almost everywhere. But if you were right up close to the Emperor, you'd be able to see that he was actually wearing a flesh-coloured body stocking. I have had over the years, particularly since 2016, a lot of days like that. I know a lot of you have as well. But it's not, is it? It's not a flesh-coloured body stocking. Owen Paterson really did behave in the most egregious of fashion, was found to have done so by the independent commissioner and then by a unanimous verdict from a jury of his peers, if you like, from the select committee, from the standards committee, which contains both MPs and lay people, every single one of whom found that he had behaved and done all of the things of which he was accused. His response was to insist that he hadn't done anything wrong because he was Owen Paterson, and therefore the motivations for breaking the rules were more important than the actual breaking of the rules. And if he'd sat up and said sorry, he'd have got a 7-day suspension and he'd have another £500,000 heading his way from the companies he lobbies for without being allowed to lobby for. He'd have just been a little bit more careful, one imagines, in the future. But we've missed one thing as we dive ever deeper into the question of what's going on. Why this, why now is the question if you're just joining us. If you are kind enough to listen to this programme on a regular basis, you'll know that we've done a fairly good job of chronicling what I could call corruption, or at least of chronicling the incompetence, of chronicling the U-turns, of both predicting, I think with almost unerring accuracy, and describing what is actually going on. Again, while most of the newspapers and many broadcasters continue to contribute to this delusion or this propaganda war on a programme like this, when we've been pointing out all of this stuff, the question of why this, why now, I thought was a big mystery in the last hour. But as we neared the end of it, the clouds began to clear. And I think perhaps, and I'd love to know how you feel about this as someone who perhaps has cast votes in Boris Johnson or Brexit's direction more recently than I have, is that what's happened in the last few days? Is that this can't be chalked up as he can do whatever he needs to do too. So I Get Brexit Done was, as with everything Dominic Cummings came up with, a 52% genius, 48% absolute malevolence. You know, or you can put it the other way around if you prefer, 52% malevolence, 48% genius. That idea that the Get Brexit Done would be, what's the word I want? It would be such an intoxicating slogan, such a heady brew, that under its influence, people would turn off their consciences. They would turn off their normal moral compasses. They would turn off their eyes and their ears, which was, of course, the party's final and most terrifying command. Get Brexit Done was both a blindfold and earplugs to the proroguing of Parliament, the misleading of the Queen, the absolute lies about the border in the Irish Sea, about what Brexit would do to... Get Brexit Done became a blindfold and earmuffs, under the influence of which ordinarily sensible, decent voters lost their faculties. Get Brexit Done. Even Barnard Castle still, I think, got passed off under Get Brexit Done. You know? Because it was only, of course, at the beginning of this year that they could sound the alarm and start claiming that they had got Brexit done. So until that, we now know, absolutely appalling withdrawal agreement kicked in on January the 1st, you could file anything under Get Brexit. We've got to keep Dominic, we've got to keep Cummings in the House, because we've got to get Brexit done, dude. It's got to get Brexit done. So we're going to send people out, and they're going to tell the British public that he really did drive to Barnard Castle and back on his wife's birthday because he needed to test his eyesight. So walking through that lobby on Wednesday, if you were taking it as an overview, you could make a case for saying that was less offensive, that was less egregious than sitting in front of a microphone as Michael Gove did, or looking down the barrel of a camera as loads of them did, and claiming that Dominic Cummings really did drive to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight. So why did they let that pass? Answer, because we were still in the business of getting Brexit done. So oddly, it got them into Downing Street. And this is Lewis's analysis from Ealing. Most essential command, the party's final most essential command. Ignore the evidence of your eyes and ears. Get Brexit Done was a blindfold. It was earmuffs. It was an invitation to ignore the evidence of your eyes and ears. But when Brexit got done, you take the blindfold off. You take the earmuffs off. And it takes you a little while to reacclimatise, I think. It takes you a while. You sort of you give your earlobes a bit of a tug and give it. What do you do when you rub your eyes a bit and you haven't quite noticed this and you haven't quite noticed that? And then along comes Andrea Leadsom and Owen Paterson, like a sort of Jack and Jill of political incompetence, one of whom has behaved in an appalling fashion and refused to admit it or acknowledge it, and one of whom is prepared to introduce an amendment to the House of Commons designed not only to let him off the hook, but also to rip up the entire rule book put in place to combat corruption. And they've fallen under the spell of the Get Brexit Done slogan as well, because they prorogued Parliament. They defended Dominic Cummings when he drove to Barnard Castle and back. So whether consciously or subconsciously, they think they can get away with murder, metaphorically speaking. That's happened to them as well. So it's not just the voters who had these blindfolds and these earmuffs on. These politicians, particularly the less intelligent ones, have also ended up in a place, whether consciously or unconsciously, where they believe they can do anything. Johnson's been like that all his life. His sense of entitlement comes from, I don't know, his DNA or his background, his education or his personality, I know not. But for the rest of them, this is an assumed sense of entitlement. Some of us are born entitled. Some of us achieve entitlement, and some of us have entitlement thrust upon us. I think this lot, in a sense, have had entitlement thrust upon them by the Get Brexit Done slogan, under which they could do anything. They could lie to the Queen under the Get Brexit Done slogan. So the idea that they could rip up the anti-corruption rulebook, it's seen through this lens, becomes relatively innocuous. I don't think they actually slap each other on the back in the Garrick Club and say, well, what are we going to do next, lads? We lied to the Queen last year. Let's rip up the anti-corruption rulebook this year. I think it's just a sort of, almost an osmosis of corruption passing from the top down, actually. A sort of trickle down of moral corruption, culminating in the idea that 250 MPs could march through the lobby marked, we'll be marking our own homework in the future, thank you very much, and the rest of you can sod off. They march through that particular lobby and think they're going to get away with it. Why? Because we got away with everything else. Question, why did you get away with everything else? Answer, because it all got filed under Get Brexit Done. But Brexit got done. And you're not ready yet, perhaps, to recognise or acknowledge that it bears no resemblance whatsoever to what these shysters and charlatans promised you. That day will come. That day edges ever closer. Reality can only ever be postponed. It can never be permanently denied. But you are ready to say, Owen Paterson taking £500,000 off a couple of companies that he then lobbied government for. That didn't get Brexit done. That's got nothing to do with Brexit. And suddenly, like the sun coming over the horizon after a dark and dismal night, you understand why people like Charles Moore, disgracefully, and why people like David Davis disingenuously tried to bring Brexit back into it. There it is. We got there in the end, an hour and a quarter into the programme. Why were they bringing Brexit back into it? Because Brexit was the blindfold. Brexit was the earmuffs. Brexit was the thing that you could say, and then the public would go, all right, carry on. Or the supporters would give you the free pass. You drove to Barnard Castle to test your eyesight. Of course you did. Of course you flipping didn't. Brexit! Oh, no, you did. You did, actually. You sent Jacob Rees-Mogg to Balmoral to mislead Her Majesty the Queen. That's absolutely a Brexit. Oh, no, that's absolutely fine. As you were, good old Jacob, doff cap, tug forelock. You prorogued our Parliament. That is the most constitutionally corrupt thing that any government has done in living. Brexit! Oh, no, that's absolutely fine. You carry on. You carry on. You publish newspaper front pages encouraging the British public to hate judges. That's so dangerous. That's the stuff of dictatorships and Brexit! Oh, no, that's fine. Carry on. Let's have another front page. But Brexit got done, you see. And so did everyone who voted for it. But as I say, that day hasn't quite dawned yet. And that's why the Owen Paterson scandal has landed in the way that it's landed. And because the Daily Mail is a pivotal piece of this jigsaw, the fact that it's now edited by somebody who was bright enough to realise that Brexit was a very bad idea is perhaps part of the process. Because the Telegraph haven't turned, the Telegraph can't turn. They're so far down the rabbit hole that they will never be able to get out again. They can't turn round. But the Mail has changed its tack. The Mail has changed its tune. Because they understand what's happened. You can't file any of this under Get Brexit Done. Why did Owen Paterson take £500,000 off a couple of companies that he was lobbying for? Brexit! Pardon? Pardon? Kwasi Kwarteng, yesterday, asked whether Boris Johnson had ever done anything in his entire career that could be seen as upholding standards in public life. I swear to you this is true. You're going to think I've made it up. Has he done anything in his entire career, on the beep, that could be described as upholding standards in public life? Do you know what Kwasi Kwarteng said? I swear to you this is true. I should have worked this out yesterday. I'm so sorry. Do you know what he said? He said, well, he got Brexit done. And that is the sound of a blindfold falling apart in real time. Kwasi Kwarteng, Secretary of State for Business, put in the Cabinet by Boris Johnson. Has the Prime Minister done anything in his entire life that could be described in any way whatsoever as upholding or promoting standards in public life? Kwasi Kwarteng's answer? You can hear his soul slipping down the plug hole as he says it. Well, he got Brexit done. And that is why we are exactly where we are. That's me done. I might go home. Seriously, is Sheila in the building yet? I've got nothing left. My quiver is empty. My arrows are all fired. So what do you think? 0345 6060 973. Why this? Why now? And is it because everything they've done up until this point could have been dishonestly excused as part of, quotes, getting Brexit done? But they can't do that. But they tried. That's the magic of this idea. They tried. That was the bit I couldn't get my head around. Why is Charles Moore writing articles about Brexit? Because oh man, you know me, I'm not one to blow my own trumpet, but that feeling you get, is it possible to die of sarcasm? That feeling you get when you're puzzled by something and it suddenly makes sense. That's a magical moment, right? And I don't think I'd have got there without Lewis and Ealing. So, Lewis, big up to you, my friend. 21 minutes after 11 is the time. Off to Belfast now, where perhaps we should have seen some of the current crises on the horizon a little more clearly than we did at the time. Brenda is there. Brenda, what would you like to say?
I think it's interesting that the two companies that were paying Owen Paterson are both Northern Ireland-based companies.
Yes. I spotted that yesterday. Tell me why that's interesting.
It's interesting because Owen Paterson was the Northern Ireland Secretary of State, appointed in 2010. A lot of people here are asking questions about why a man with such power in the north of Ireland was all of a sudden being paid by two major companies here. One of them is Randox. Who then went on to win a massive contract from the British government in regards to COVID supplies.
They did.
And questions are now being asked in the north.
Yes, I'm not surprised.
People are speaking to their elected representatives.
Given that it is against the rules to lobby for any company, to lobby government on behalf of any company, why would they give him £500,000 or, in their case, 120 grand a year?
There's so many more layers to this, James. People here are struggling. You know, you're talking about Brexit and people want to get Brexit done. But I think what should be noted by people who don't live in Northern Ireland is that we're actually speaking about a situation here that is about life or death. We are dealing with paramilitaries that are threatening to kill people.
As we saw in Newton Ards earlier this week, the stakes are rising almost daily, aren't they?
Well, we actually had civil disruption 10 minutes from my house where there was an anti-DUP. It was actually a loyalist protest that ended up in the police having to turn up with rat squads to quell the violence. I understand that people are talking about they want to get Brexit done. There was a vote. The Northern Ireland actually voted to remain within the EU, as did Scotland. And we're being forced into a situation, and it seems that the corruption is starting to surface here. Like I said, Owen Paterson was the Secretary of State
Northern Ireland, and lo and behold, since leaving that office, he's £500,000 to the good from two Northern Irish companies.
But what I would like to know, as a voter, what I would like to know is when was the initial contact made between these two companies to canvass on their behalf?
You're obviously suspicious that it would have happened when he was Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, rather than perhaps being on holiday in Belfast or.
Well, he's still an elected representative, even though he no longer held the office of Secretary of State. The fact he was still receiving that money.
I mean, that is a helpful and welcome Northern Irish perspective, and you forgive me, I hope, Brenda, but you can't keep it all in your head at the same time. I noticed yesterday they were both Northern Irish companies, and I was 95% certain that he'd been Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, but that 5% stopped me pointing it out, and then by the time the clock turned and I forgot to double check. So I'm so glad you've returned our attention to this today. But I'd be interested to know why you think on the the bigger stage, the stage that encompasses all four nations of the United Kingdom, why do you think this story has exploded in the way that it has?
To be honest with you, from the perspective of living in Belfast, we're sort of slightly curious as to why it's happened, because we're so used to manipulation of politicians by companies, the lobbying of things that have happened. We're so used to it. We grew up, I'm 54, I live in West Belfast. We grew up in a highly politicised environment, so people here are actually quite savvy politically. Not so much, obviously, with Labour or Tories, because, we don't vote for the people that go into Westminster to the same extent. We have our elected representatives there. but we don't hold much sway, except whenever, obviously, when Theresa May paid the DUP $1.5 billion to prop up her government.
Yeah.
Look how that worked out.
No.
But I know. But it's just, we're curious because we here know, and a lot of people might say, well, that's not the truth and all, but we here know that Northern Ireland is basically a pain on the back of Westminster, especially with Brexit, because if they breach an international peace agreement, which is the Good Friday Agreement, and your government has already breached agreements, and they're basically
it's your government too, mate. It's your government too, mate.
Well, yeah, but we don't really have a say, and it's obviously a Tory majority, or a Labour majority. Whatever happens, we don't have a say in the laws that are being there. We are run by we obviously are,
of course,
Stormont. But there's one thing I do want to say to you, James, and this is what a lot of people here are talking about. Randox is a global company that is obviously Northern Ireland based, which increasing evidence is showing that they moved their financial interests offshore to the Isle of Man.
Yes, I saw this yesterday. You sound like you're not going to go on dangerous legal grounds for me. You're leading me out of my comfort zone. So just be aware of that. And I'm happy to be led, but I will err on the side of caution if you worry me.
I completely understand. I also don't want to open myself up to anything either.
No.
But we also have to look at the fact that Randox has received massive funding from our block grant for research and development for decades. We're going back an awful long time.
Right.
Applications have been made for the amount of money that's been awarded to them in grant, free money basically from our block grant. While we struggle here, like most places are, to maintain our essential services. It's also interesting to know that Randox sponsors the Grant National Entry.
It does.
To the tune of millions of pounds. And Owen Paterson has a very strong connection to the entry.
Well, his late wife was I think the chair of the racecourse or something like that.
Yeah, so there's so many things that need to be looked at here, James. But to bring it back to Brexit,
yes,
we're curious here as to what's going on because, as I said, people will talk about Brexit, but it is a matter of life and death here, James. People here are actually worried that people are going to start dying again through violence, and it's a very humanitarian prospect to look at. You can't just turn your eyes away from that. We have suffered enough, James, and we don't want this happening again. And this Brexit problem with the Good Friday Agreement and the protocol is manufactured, is in the hands of Westminster.
Yeah.
And they have a duty to the people here to make sure that nobody else buries another child, another parent, or another spouse. And that's the bottom line. So why are they holding us up? Talking about Brexit, Owen Patterson, former Secretary of State, what's going on, James?
I've got nothing to add to any of that, except just to anyone who perhaps doubts the depth of your concerns and your worries should have a little look at what Dominic Cummings has had to say about Ireland and Northern Ireland and the impact of Brexit on the peace process. And
we've always been very aware. He said that apparently they didn't care if they fell into the sea. But the bottom, we're talking about someone who hasn't really displayed any serious depth of humanity.
No.
We're not foolish. We're not foolish. We know her people in England. I lived in England for 2 years. I worked in Warwickshire for 2 years. I know the general feeling of Northern Ireland as regards the English. The lack of knowledge in reference to the North as well is very, very low. People in England don't know that we didn't have the right to vote.
And, just to bring it back to where we started, the idea that a former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland could be a cheerleader for Brexit is almost unbelievable. And yet almost all of them were. Villiers wasn't she, as well? But Patterson was there. Patterson was there. He walked the streets and then thought the Good Friday Agreement, even didn't understand that it would be jeopardised or thought it was somehow a price worth paying for. I've forgotten what.
But did he walk the streets and take on board the humanitarian, or did he walk the streets, roll his eyes, and figure how could he line his pockets with money from companies that were based here?
Well,
because it seems to me that he came here to serve himself and not to serve the people here.
It's pretty hard to see how one would start to refute that, given that there's £500,000 worth of evidence in your corner of the conversation.
But how deep does it go?
How deep does it go?
Questions are going to be asked. I've spoken personally to one of our elected representatives who's an MP, Claire Hanna, who's an MP in Westminster, an amazing woman, who was the Brexit spokesperson for the SDLP, and her integrity is unquestionable. And we have approached and said we need questions asked in Stormont regarding funding for Randox, how are they approached and to be lobbied for? What's happening with the award of the grant? Regards any financial transactions that should be looked at? All these questions. This is not over by a long shot, James.
Keep me posted, Brenda.
I will indeed. Thank you for taking my call.
Hey, any time at all. I've got a lifetime of not paying enough attention to Northern Ireland to make up for, as I realised shortly after that referendum result came in 2016. 11:30 is the time. Most recent figures I can find, 133 million quid's worth of contract given to Randox for test kits that were used at home and at some test centres. And remember, the Dido Harding's absolute clown car of a test and trace system is still being labelled the NHS test and trace by people who possibly don't have the best interests of the NHS at heart. I'll take a couple more calls on this. Then I'm going to shamelessly use my radio programme to draw your attention to a cause very, very close to my heart. And then after 12 o'clock, I think we will have a little look at shortages. Quite a lot going on that probably isn't being reported properly. For example, do we know what happened to the pigs that were facing a cull? Do we know how many pigs ended up being destroyed and sort of burnt on farms? I don't know that we do. I do know, because it's been reported somewhere, that the massive shortage of butchers in this country means that we are now exporting carcasses to the continent where they will be chopped up and butchered and then exporting them back in again to sell, which adds an entirely unnecessary, I beg your pardon, it adds an entirely sovereignty-flavoured extra cost to any meat product that now has to go through that process as a consequence of labour shortages. I'm keeping an eye on that care home story. Thursday's the day that approximately 1 in 10 care home workers will be fired because they will not have been vaccinated by Thursday. And my view on that story just went absolutely through the mangle earlier this week when we opened up the phone lines. It was one of those penny drop moments where I suddenly realised, yeah, all right, I don't care whether or not you think they should be vaccinated. What is going to happen if they're not? Really, really good example of remembering to turn with the world as the world turns. Because I'll tell you what, I was this close to doing another phone-in with me, thumping the desk and saying they should be fired if they haven't been vaccinated. But the world's turning and Thursday's getting ever closer and they haven't been vaccinated. So what are we going to do? Answer, according to Sajid Javid, still is hand them their sandwiches wrapped in a roadmap, although the threat of treating the entire NHS similarly, oddly enough, has now been removed. So keep an eye on that. But the shortage of taxi drivers is something that an awful lot of people outside the studio, as it were, have been talking to me about in the last few weeks. There's just real struggles getting a car, getting a cab right up and down the country as well. I have a little look at that. Not hard to think of some reasons why that might be, but as ever on the programme, we'll try and get to the heart of it rather than just the surface. 11:37 is the time. Mo's in Birmingham. Back to Patterson. Mo, what do you reckon?
Hello, James. Thank you for taking my call.
You're most welcome.
Personally, James, I think there are a lot of right-wing commentators, Tory MPs, newspapers like the Daily Mail, that have now are very uncomfortable with the direction that Boris Johnson is taking this Conservative Party in. They've seen the budget from last week with the tax burden at the highest level.
Yeah, well played. No one's raised that yet. So, we're giving them a bit of a pat on the back for finally seeing the light, but they could actually be coming at it from a rather less attractive angle, which is, hang on a minute, you're not supposed to tax the rich.
Yeah. They've seen all this talk around COP26 and all these costs in regards to making Britain more environmentally friendly and net zero and so on. They've seen this muddled approach to Brexit. You see, James, in my opinion, there were only ever... The coalition that held Brexit together, in my book, was made up of two distinct groups.
Go on.
Those that wanted capitalism on steroids, like a Singapore in the Atlantic, and those that wanted to pull up the drawbridge and turn Britain into a sort of hermit state. And that glue that held the two together is now starting to fall apart, which is why... You see the likes of, let's say, Tim Martin from Mr. Weatherspoons saying, immigration is good, it's okay. We voted for Brexit not necessarily to stop immigration. And then maybe the ordinary person in the red wall that actually says, well, actually, we want to draw up
the drawbridge.
The drawbridge.
I don't know if we need to bring the red wall. There's people like that up and down the country. And this isn't a go at you, because you're providing brilliant analysis. I do increasingly find myself balking at the portrayal of red wall, which is kind of a synonym for working class, as being I mean, the biggest racist I've ever met went to public school. Some of them even ended up leading political parties. So I know you didn't mean that, but I just want to make that absolute. This is not a platform where we either punt or fall for the lie that racism is somehow. I think of Cable Street back in the day. I'll just say that again. The biggest racists I've ever met all went to public school. So this is not a working class monopoly. But I know you didn't suggest it was. I'm just putting that on the record.
Let me rephrase that. I think it is. That is the perception that I think is openly punted by those organisations that have gaslit them into thinking that that's what they are.
Mostly led by public school boys.
Correct.
Yes.
And I think, and that's my thing.
Whose names might rhyme with that building you keep your car in.
Yeah.
Depending on how you pronounce it.
Yeah, and I think newspapers like the Daily Mail, this is their way. It's a shot across the bow to Boris Johnson, say, look, we want our Conservative Party back. We don't want something which they perceive resembles Ed Miliband's, Ed Ball's manifesto from 2015, for example.
Yeah, remember who's in charge is what they're really saying with these front pages. I wouldn't
be surprised if there are people like Mr. Gove and so on, who they again perceive to be more traditional Tories, that are, saying it is time to feed back. And I think, my final point, I know you've got a busy show and all here. If you remember back a couple of weeks ago, there was a lot of talk around Boris Johnson about how he wanted to emulate Margaret Thatcher by going on and on and on and on. Now that they've seen what Boris Johnson and his government looks like, it horrifies them, actually. So again, it's not the Tory party that they want. And so this is, I think, a means of squeezing him into telling us, we put you there. Now, you need to
the calls today have been off the scale, as is so often the case these days. But I think it's almost this desperation for good news that leads you to think, oh, fantastic, look at this, the Daily Mail are going up. But actually, they could be coming, as you point out, from the point of view of the vested interests, who are going to be asked to put their hands in their pockets to pay for the aftermath of the Brexit that they helped to sell, of course, just to bring the irony into it, but also, the rebuilding that we're going to need following COVID. The idea that this is where Labour are very lucky to be in opposition, because they can complain about tax rises without really having to offer up a meaningful or substantive alternative to tax rises. But I don't really see how anyone could argue that we could come out of the last 2 years, even if you're still pretending that Brexit isn't going to leave a huge hole in the economy, which everybody sensible knows it is, but just COVID alone, you're going to have public spending increase, and that can only be paid for in one way.
And I know you said the Telegraph is steadfastly behind Boris Johnson. I think even today...
No, they've led the line on what you describe. They're the ones that are more...
There was an opinion piece that said that, this looks like a government in its final days. How could you say that about a government that has an 80-seat majority, by which, by all intents and purposes, should win the next election as well? Very strange piece that. Maybe that's more akin to... This is like a Boris Johnson government at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, exactly that. Not a Conservative government. A shot across the bows. Hang on, pal. We knew that you were a shameless opportunist when we put you in power as the head of the Leopards Eating People's Faces party, but we didn't realise that your shameless opportunism might end up leading to our faces being eaten by leopards. I shot across the... Yeah, I think you're probably right, actually, at least in part. Certainly some of the columnists, as you mentioned, leader writers and opinion pieces, are pretty close to making that point. Hang on a minute, this isn't very conservative, all this public spending. Are you really expecting rich people to bear the brunt of responsibility for rebuilding the country that has made them rich in the aftermath of COVID? Brackets don't mention the fact that the Office of Budgetary Responsibility estimates that Brexit will do twice as much damage to this country's economy as the actual pandemic, close brackets. Pip's in Oswestry, which I think is the first call of the day from Owen Paterson's, is it former constituency now? It is, isn't it? He'll be the Chiltern Hundreds, or the other one. No, Tracy Brabin will still be the Chiltern Hundreds. He is no longer an MP, so you currently don't have an MP. Pip, what would you like to say?
Well, I think that it's about time Owen Patterson went, to be honest. It's been a bog awful constituency MP.
He'd have waltzed home if there was a by-election last week, wouldn't he?
Oh, absolutely. And the Conservatives might win again because, who knows?
20-odd thousand majority. It'd take a heck of a lot to overturn that. And Labour have said, well, we've been on air, that they're not going to put, one unity anti-government candidate. They're not going to sort of...
Well, I was in the Labour Party for years, and I think that's ridiculous. We need a unity candidate.
Keir Starmer's calculation will be, what if we lose? What if we do this? It's a bit like playing all your trump cards and we still lose. It's going to do more damage than running it as a normal by-election and still losing. So they're prioritising not losing humiliatingly over winning. And that's the risk, isn't it? That's the calculation.
It's ridiculous.
I think you're probably right.
You use the word Trump. Patterson had several meetings with Trump in the White House.
Did he?
Yeah.
You sure?
Oh yeah.
Just consulting my Encyclopedia Politica.
I can send you evidence of that if you like.
I believe you.
He also went to China during the Badger-Cull because China was having problems with powdered milk.
North Shropshire MP Owen Patterson met with...
buy our milk because of TB.
What are you telling me? The North Shropshire MP Owen Patterson holds talks with Donald Trump. There it is, in the Shropshire Star, the doughty local newspaper in your neck of the world, on his state visit to the EU. Ian Duncan Smith and I had a meeting with just President Trump.
Yes.
He said, although he could not divulge what was said in the meeting, he said it was fascinating.
Absolutely.
Why would Donald Trump be meeting with Owen Patterson and Ian Duncan Donuts, Pip? I think we should be told.
Yeah. Owen Paterson also is a big proponent of genetically modified foods. He likes pesticides, herbicides.
What do you mean, likes pesticides?
He likes.
Of course he doesn't like... I know what you mean, but you make it sound like he has them for breakfast.
Oh, he probably does.
You're making me a little nervous now. Everything you've said so far is true, but I think I'm late for the break. I'm going to head for the break before you say something that I can't Google and double-check.
Just to cut to the chase...
Please.
I voted for Brexit. About 12 months after I'd voted for it, I felt severely ashamed of myself.
There's no shame.
I fell out with my sister, who actually supplied you with some lovely socks.
Oh, is that your sister? They are lovely socks. God, but she was a full-on... She was a hardcore Remainer.
My sister?
Yeah.
Nikki Thompson?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's quite an interesting schism, a sororial schism in Shropshire. Oh, Shropshire doesn't have the S sound at the beginning of it, does it?
Yeah, but she's now got a residency in Spain. So,
send her my love.
And I'm obviously, we're back being sisterly.
I'm very glad to hear it. A lot of people fell out. At least you only had a year of ructions before the clouds cleared and the light dawned. I've still got those socks. Very nice they are too. Thank you, Pip. Take care. And of course, actually, before you go, Pip, can I just establish which drama school you went to? Because there's a rump of listeners to this programme who think everybody who rings in to say that they voted for Brexit and they've now changed their mind must be some sort of stooge or fake. So did you go to RADA, Webber Douglas, Lambda, or the Scottish Academy of Dramatic Art?
All of them.
There you go. And my God, it shows, because you are good.
Pussycat,